Okay, and without further ado, the center panel of our triptych, Kamal Sinclair.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. You guys are the lifeblood of a lot of the work that we do in media. As Vince said, I come from the Sundance Institute. I direct the New Frontier Story Lab, which is essentially a kind of R&D space for storytellers and media makers, creative technologists that are trying to, figure out what is this new future of storytelling that comes with these new capabilities. I'm also the emerging media consultant for the Ford Foundation, which is a great honor to work with Just Films and try to figure out what does equality, which is the core mission for the Ford Foundation, what does that look like in this emerging media landscape? So I am what you call a montage presenter. I'm going to show a lot of images very quickly and talk over them very quickly and give you a lot of information. Don't worry about writing it down or trying to retain it. It's all on immerse.news. Jessica Clark. All right. Let's see, we got an advance. All right, so just a little bit of background about Just Films commissioned me to do some research on this question of how do we further equality in emerging media. And part of the process of that was interviewing over 100 stakeholders in emerging media, from VCs and high-level executives at studios down to very independent DIY makers, as well as grassroots activists, public media executives, all across the board. Also, a lot of my colleagues and peers in the field. And it is being published on immerse.news. And also a review of a lot of industry articles over a year's period. Having a little bit of an advance issue. Should I point here? Or point up there? Okay. So the first question, I asked people pretty much 3 questions. What is emerging media? What are your concerns in terms of equality? And what are some ways that you would recommend intervening so that we can mitigate those concerns? So this first part is where the montage happens. So put your thinking caps on. Essentially, New Frontier's mandate as a curatorial program is to look for artists that are hacking and inventing and figuring out meaning and resonance in the communication architecture, which, as you know, anybody that's lived in the last 20 years has seen that communication architecture evolve very rapidly, and we're still at even the beginning of yet another disruption around how we share and communicate story, meaning, information. And Tabitha Jackson, who is the head of our documentary department, always says that story doesn't exist until it has been heard. So in something at the fundamental place of where story lives, it lives in this communication architecture, whether that be a broadcast narrative or whether it be something very different that is taking these new forms where agency, interactivity, and immersion are part of that form. So we're looking at, over the next 10 years, where is this stuff going? One of our artists, Alex McDowell, who was the art director on Minority Report, always talks about the power of imagination, innovation, and then manifestation. So we're talking about the works that these storytellers are doing is not just for this art for art's sake, which it is, but it also, this work is defining many aspects of what our future states are based on that imagination to innovation to manifestation. He actually worked in a collaborative design process for building out the story world of Minority Report, and out of that process 20 some odd years ago, there's that imagination process. There's been, he quotes, about 100 patents that have come into real life from that imagination process. So when we're talking about storytellers and its impact on equality, we're not talking about something that feels kind of fluffy and lighthearted, and we're talking about something that's very real, that we do have a power in storytelling to set a ideology, a thinking, a pathway, an imagination for what we do manifest. This is one of the things that were patented. It was a gestural-based way to edit film. So this is like pre-Wii, you start to use your hands to create a gestural interface. And the thing that I also like to talk about is how in the New Frontier community we've seen not only imagination manifest function, which is in this case a very functional use of this technology, but then that functionality now changing back into poetry and imagination. So this is a piece by Chris Milk where you use your body and that gestural-based interface to create a triptych, which is a poem of the birth and the death and the rebirth of creativity. So just want to kind of talk about the importance of thinking about not just the function that comes out of these imagination processes, but also in a real way, how important creative expression is through these mediums. All right, this is just another one of our artists that has a lot of patents in projection mapping, so I'll pass that. So now I'm going to kind of do a quick overview kind of survey of what are the categories of emerging media that I heard from the field, how they're defining emerging media, which some people were all the way at anything beyond television is emerging still, anything that's based on the internet in any way, shape, or form, and other people were way at the other end of the spectrum talking about biomedia and artificial intelligence and connected immersion in terms of wired cities and wired spaces. So I'll kind of try to quickly show you that gamut through the eyes of the artist, and that's one of our fundamental things at Sundance and New Frontiers, that we follow the artists into this future, whatever that is, and not be prescriptive to them. This is a piece by Lynette Walworth, which is kind of playing with the idea of tactile media and how, as much as we've gone to virtual spaces with our storytelling, we don't want to lose what it means to be a physical being in this digital world. And so she's bringing back that idea of how does touch and tactile relationships with story and representation impact stories. So this was an installation where she had interviewed many women that had gone through some of the worst atrocities in the world, from Holocaust, genocide, rape, war, and interviewed them and wrote their stories into a book. So you go in and you read their stories in a book, and then you step up to a screen and put your hand on the screen, and out of the darkness, one of those women will walk towards you and put her hand directly onto your hand. And this messed people up, right? Just really messed people up. So again, now we're seeing other artists that are using the haptics, the ability to use touch in like a tablet form to bring back what does it do to our lizard brain to have a relationship of physical touch in these meaningful and resonant story experiences. We're seeing the evolution of interactive film, where before, like the merger of film and gaming, you have like a branching narrative and you have to choose A or choose B. And sometimes it was very wonky. It kind of took you out of the emotional cinematic fluidity of the experience. And now we're seeing artists that are actually being able to cross over and make that bridge. This is one of the projects by the Daniels, where they were able to achieve cinematic fluidity, but still give the audience agency to choose up to 12 different scenarios of where the film went. We're seeing hybridization between like documentary film and gaming. This is a piece called 1979 Revolution, where the artist's aim was, he lived through the revolution in Iran, and when the Arab Spring happened, he said, oh, Western media has no idea what they're talking about. They don't understand what it's like to be in the fog of war, where you have to make political, moral, and survival choices with no context. And so he wanted to use gaming, where you do have that agency, to put you in the shoes of someone in history that had to make those very important decisions, and then you have to live out those consequences as they did. So again, artists that are not necessarily new technology, but a new approach to that technology. Now I'm going to go really fast. So we have geo-aware storytelling, where things are unlocked very specifically to spaces that you are standing. We have even geo-aware composition. This is a piece that I love, where you can go to the National Mall, and the composition of the symphony experience can go on 400 different parallel tracks, where when you get to the obelisk, all the instruments come in. If you go to one place, the violins are in. If you go to another place, it's the timpani. And so literally mapping sound, mapping content, mapping art to landscape and architecture and space. Ephemeral media, this was really interesting to me. Somebody that's quite older in the interview set said, you know, I'm really interested that the young people are going to ephemeral media in a world where Facebook tracked their whole lives from birth. You know, why are they reaching back for something that feels like returning to ritual, where you can have a moment that never exists again, where you can have that scarcity of time? Immersive theater that is bringing in all kinds of things like projection mapping and different ways in which augmented reality and holographic cinema is coming in. And data visualization. Now, this is nothing new. If you're a journalist these days, you know that data visualization is one of your core tools in your storytelling toolbox. But what I find interesting is that we're moving from a screen-based data visualization to omnipresent ambient data storytelling. So in this case, this is a artifact from a library in Brooklyn that's an Afrofuturist library. You can check it out. It was collaboratively designed with people in Brooklyn with the IAPA repository. You check out this lantern from the future, and you can walk around New York City, and whenever you pass a spot where a black person has been killed by a police officer, it will light up. And so that changes the nature of storytelling in a very different way, where you're not getting a lot of screen time, you're not getting a lot of, but just the nature of having the context of standing in that spot and knowing what that meaning is brings a whole new canvas for artists to work with. Again, ways in which digital is impacting very analog, and this is a mirror pegboard that changes to your face. This is a Twitter table that every time a certain hashtag comes out on Twitter, it'll print a picture from that hashtag in the box. So you don't see, again, any screens, but you're connected to something that is digital but is very physical. So this is kind of a trend that we're seeing, especially as the Internet of Things and connected environments and wired environments become more prevalent. Olfactory, this is famous deaths. It was the future of storytelling. They recreated the last moments of JFK's life through sound and scent only. I didn't experience it, but I've heard that it's a pretty powerful experience. And then one thing that we're seeing a lot in this future storytelling scape is how do characters live on multiple devices, very literally. So this is a piece with Arcade Fire. One of our artists worked with them, and you can use your cell phone if you're watching the video, and you can manipulate light, and you have this relationship between two devices where the audience has a slight impact on the artistry of the piece. And then at the very end, your face falls into the video, and the protagonist falls onto your phone. So you're literally, like, what does it mean if Hamlet can jump from the screen to your hand to an actor on stage? That's a whole different kind of canvas to play with as an artist. And the other thing that we really want to think about, we showed this at the New Frontier last year, is the impact of these new technologies that are kind of hacking the brain on, like, what does that mean as an artist to have to reconcile with things that are being used in, like, treatment of paraplegics that are helping with VR devices that are able to get brain inputs and then connect to an exoskeleton, help paraplegic people start to slightly move their toes and hold their bowels and have a higher quality of life. I mean, this is very, very early research, but if this is what's happening on the health and science with virtual reality in connection with these new technologies, what does that mean for story? What are the ethical implications of someone who's creating works in virtual reality or through these immersive mediums in terms of how it affects our sense of reality in our brain? I'm not going to get into the details, but all I got to say is that what you've seen in VR is not VR. Most of you have probably not experienced full hyper reality, full extended reality versions of these immersive mediums, but they're quite incredible. This is a piece we had at the festival, VRI, that is actually a social VR piece that was so faithful to your body and space, but yet created this sense of awe and wonder and being able to go beyond your pedestrian existence. It was quite stunning. And then, of course, we have light field technology, which is changing the kind of photorealistic ability to fill this kind of 3D spaces, because I won't get into the technical details there, but that's going to change the sense of losing the uncanny valley in a lot of these virtual experiences. Augmented reality, this is a piece that was on Microsoft HoloLens that just was absolutely gorgeous. Had dancers coming out of the floor, landing on my hand. I could put them there, then they came out of the thing, and then there was a little theater, and I got to put my head in the theater and look all around. I mean, it was insane. It was so gorgeous. And then this is, has anybody heard about this from the Shoah Foundation, New Dimensions in Testimony? Okay, great. So this is like kind of broke the lid off of what's the future of documentary and what's the future of memoir and what's the future of it's kind of like Marjorie Prime come to life. This is a gentleman who's a Holocaust survivor, and through holographic capture, volumetric capture, they interviewed him, I think it was like 1,000 questions or something like that, put the interview into a database with a natural language processing infrastructure on the piece. So you go up to a microphone and you ask him a question, his hologram a question, and he faithfully responds in a conversation with you. So the discovery of your ancestors, the discovery of your family, the discovery of your history can be conversational and not just one-way broadcast or linear. Now let's talk about wearables and the ways in which bio-responsive technology is in some ways, this is very old technology, but how it's also, we know that with wearable tech, there's a lot of innovation happening. This was a piece by Yehuda Duenas where he wanted to give people the sense of what it feels like to be on stage as an actor, dancer, musician, and how you have to have this Zen-like center internally while you're having to deal with all of this kind of distractions, lights, sounds, clapping. How do you balance your inner life with this outer, stimulations? So he created a game out of it where you have some biometric devices on you that are reading kind of various aspects of your heart rate and all those kinds of things. And the calmer you can be, the more Zen-like you can be, the higher you get pulled up in the air, and the crazier the lights get, the crazier the ticker tape, the sound. So basically, if you get that high, you got some serious Zen skills internally. How are artists, we've been following a couple of artists that are playing with this different ways in which even our own biometric data is starting to inform storytelling and experience and interactivity. And of course, we have cyborgs now. It's official. You guys may have seen this artist who has been wearing this device for over a decade to help him hear color because he's colorblind. And he actually started the Cyborg Foundation. He works with a dancer who has sensors on her body that every time the seismic activity happens around the Earth, it's vibrating on her body. And so she feels like she can't even see the Earth as a stable rock anymore. She sees it as a living, breathing thing. So how do these new superhuman capabilities of data, coming into our awareness, whether it be through wearables or augmented reality, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, how does that change our sense of reality and the way that we see our world? Another cyborg. And then DNA. This is an artist that went around New York City, collected people's fingernails, gum, and cigarette butts, and not only knows more about them than they probably know about themselves in terms of health and ancestry, but she came up with a methodology to approximate a model of their face, and has 3D printed their face and hung them in a gallery with that data available. So she's pushing at privacy, and you think privacy with Facebook is an issue. Yeah, we don't. She actually has a spray that she puts on wine glasses at dinner that can put so much DNA on the glass that it scrambles it so you can't be detected. But the point is that, when we're dealing with these issues like privacy in social media, what does it mean when we have biomedia? And I know this is very early and it may not even be something that becomes very usable as a software, quote unquote, or bioware, but we have the ability to code imagery and content onto DNA molecules now and code it, and that's the recall of what was coded onto DNA. So what is that? I was interviewing a journalist that was working in this area, and I said, so does the future mean I can have my family archive on my dog? And she said, probably. So what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean when media expands to those kind of definitions, right? All right, and we have robots, of course, that are coming here all around us. So what are the concerns, right? If you have this broad of a spectrum of emerging media, much of it that is so early that we don't even know what we don't know about it, what are the concerns that we need to think about as we mitigate these things? Well, when I interviewed Josh Breitbart from the New York City's mayor's office, I thought he had a very compelling statement that, the progress of racial justice and the development of technologies are not linear. Every time you develop a new technology, you need to have a thought process about the history and system of oppression that the technology is being created and released into. Think about ways to bend the technology to justice and not allow it to replicate, entrench, and worsen injustice. So much of what we've talked about today is that fact. How do we bend this new technology to justice and not entrench? We've seen a lot of entrenching and worsening and replicating injustice. We've also seen the promise of this. How do we harness the promise and not replicate the bad? Well, I got a front row seat to a second birth, or the second round of innovation around virtual reality. It's a 40-year-old medium. But I got a front row seat because the first prototype for the Oculus Rift was created to bring a piece by Noni de la Pena to Sundance in 2012. And so I saw, it go from a prototype with an intern of hers that was in his teens that, because they couldn't take the USC headset off campus, had to use a cell phone to create a kind of a simulation of it up at Park City, Utah. I got to go from seeing that 19-year-old or 20-year-old go from this to $2 billion sell to Facebook and into what is now Oculus and all of the stuff that Facebook has been doing around kind of letting Oculus be its flagship around virtual reality. And it was quite a journey for me as a woman of color who doesn't come from a tech background. I got to go to the first Oculus Developers Conference in 2014, and out of 150,000 people who had a developer's kit for the Oculus, they only selected 1,000 to come to this very prestigious event, and I got to be a moderator on a panel, and I show up, and I had like some ethnic clothes on, and my hair was kind of big, and I walked into a ballroom of white men, all almost in the same outfit, and, and I was like, whoa, I had never quite been in that much of a homogenous situation. I mean, I literally took pictures of the girls' bathroom because it was empty like crickets. I was like, this is crazy. But at first I had to get over my imposter syndrome, and I like forced myself to move in the room and not go to Starbucks, and I shook everyone's hand. It was like being like what I imagined the moment that Steve Jobs was like starting to announce like the Apple II or something. It was just like everybody's like, yeah. I felt this like energy of we're going to change the world, and I felt fine. I felt included. And then we had the plenary session at the end of the 3 days, and all the top executives were on stage. And one of the women from LEVR, who's one of the like top DIY bloggers for VR at the time, she got up in front of 1,000 people and said, "Hey, so what are you guys going to do about the apparent gender gap here?" And not only did she get shut down from the stage on the basis of meritocracy and that they had to get this headset to ship and they couldn't be worried about anything but getting the best of the best, and if you're not the best of the best, then you're not going to be involved. She got hazed online so badly that she was afraid for her life, just from asking that question. So that raised a red flag for me. I was like, oh, okay, where are we? What's happening? Then I go into MIT and I hung out with Sepp Kamvar, who is one of the kind of original guys that was part of the search engine development for Google many years ago, ran the social computing group at the time, and he told me that code is the new superpower. Code defines a social process, and that social process defines our world. And he used all kinds of examples from Twitter and food trucks and Airbnb and Uber and green spaces. And that was really exciting to hear, but it was also scared the out of me, because when you look at the statistics of who's writing code, it was the same kind of homogeny that was in that room that I was at Oculus. So then I went to Google headquarters and I hung out with Robert Wong, who at the time was the head of the Google Creative Lab, and he told me that he was concerned that we wouldn't be designing into a human-centered future because he was afraid that the artists were getting marginalized and didn't have decision-making power in helping to impact those design decisions around that new superpower called code. And so then again, I was like, oh, guys, so women, people of color, and artists are marginalized in this space. And, I have an MBA, and he was saying the MBAs and the engineers are making a lot of those decisions, but they're making them in silos, and they're not, and he's afraid that can create some issues. So then I went to Oxford, to the Skull World Forum, and I was sitting with the futurist for one of the top tech companies in the world, and I turned to him, and he showed me this video of the future with all of its whiz-bang gadgets. It was so slick and so exciting, but it was pretty soulless and pretty homogenous. And so I asked him, I said, so who's helping you to imagine the future? I said, do you have anybody from the arts or the humanities on your team that's helping you to imagine this future? And this is a department that actually built out whole buildings, whole office spaces and whole homes to imagine literally what is the life of the future going to be for the everyday person. Dang it, 5 minutes. Okay. And in the end, he said, no, we don't have anybody but engineers. And I thought, I love me some engineers, trust me. But I thought, oh, and then he said, you know what? That's a blind spot. And does anyone know why the Columbia exploded when NASA launched it many, many years ago? Say it again? Yes. But if you look at their full report, which I had to study in grad school, they said that the number one thing that they kind of brought it back to as to why that tragedy happened was groupthink. It was that they had too much of a structure that was top down. They didn't have diversity of thought. And now we know what happens with blind spots in our innovation and our push into the future. And so I won't go into much detail because I only have 5 more minutes. But when you think about the fact that in 500 years of mass media, we've never really seen inclusion. We've never really seen robust inclusion of the voices that are actually living on the planet. How many blind spots have we been editing out of that process? Especially when you think about the Industrial Revolution of the past and things like Heather Ray, the filmmaker and indigenous rights activist, talks about how keeping those voices silent for so long has left us with a bill called climate change. Well, if climate change is the bill from our last industrial revolution, because we had those blind spots or we had that exclusion, what is going to be the blind spot? What is the bill we're going to have to pay for the blind spots we have now? Because we're continuing those patterns of not having enough people at the table to define those futures in a robust way so that we can optimize them and not just optimize them for revenue, but optimize them for the well-being of humanity, right? So this is a list, it's all on the website, of many of the different things that people identified in big buckets of what were the concerns. Definitely silos between art and technology and policy, commerce, and science. So the more that we can break down those barriers, the better chance we have of maybe optimizing those human-centered design futures. I won't tell you what this was, but it was a pretty awesome example. And then, so literally, there's 180 pages on here. So I was feeling pretty sad when I was at Oxford. I was like, oh no, this is AI, the apocalypse, all this kind of stuff was happening. And then I said, you know what? I was walking with Tabitha Jackson again, and I looked at her, I said, you know what? This dystopian future that I'm imagining has not happened yet. So how do we think more like Jane Jacobs and do the interventions now so that we can keep our green spaces while having innovation? How do we set value systems and infrastructures around these new mediums so that we can have that, whatever human-centered design future means, from multiple perspectives? So quickly, the interventions, robust inclusion of the imagination of our future. Again, all these are essays online. You can look at them. But one I wanted to touch base on before I get off of this stage is design public space. We talked a lot about that earlier, and I really appreciated the words from Ethan and from Eli around what does it mean to design public space in these emerging medium platforms. And a lot of what they talked about dealt with, well, in 2 seconds, Kara Mertes from Just Films, my first meeting about this commission, she said, okay, so when television was an emerging medium, it was in the halls of Ford Foundation that we recognized that it was commercial and that we needed public space. So we created ITVS and PBS, right? So that was the seed of it, right? She said, but we were 25 years too late, and all we got was PBS. And so she said, can you figure out how we can intervene with public media and emerging mediums? And I'm like, I don't know how to do that. I'm glad there's some peers in the room that are figuring it out. But step one, people, for Web 1.0, people are just trying to get public Wi-Fi and get access. We're still fighting that fight, right? The UN made it a priority, still not something that you see robustly around the world. Web 2.0, not just access to the internet, but access to safe, transparent, and platforms that are not designed for addiction but designed for well-being. We're now fighting that fight, right? So, but who is already starting to fight the fight around Web 3.0 or immersive web, where you're dealing with VR, AR, connected immersion, wired cities? Where are we starting to put the interventions in now? Are we already 10 years too late on that, right? Or is now the time for that? Or do we need to be focusing on Web 4.0, which is that idea that everything is run through your personal AI that connects to all things digital, informational, and immersive? I don't know where that point is. I know that we have to fight all those fights, but I don't want to be 25 years too late. I don't want to have to be watching another Zuckerberg up in front of Congress for Web 3.0 or Web 4.0. We have to do those things now. We have to do everything that was talked about earlier today about establishing a safe, transparent, and net neutral internet now. But trust me when I say the game board is already being designed, and we need to make sure that we're at that table helping to design that next game board. Thank you very much.